Hello. Today I wanted to kind of go into a exploration of myself through the Lacanian Framework. What brings me to the Lacanian Framework or the psychoanalytic Lacanian Framework, is that I've been reading a book by Slavoj Zizek called The Parallax View. And today, while reading, Zizek was specifically talking about the contemporary situation in some terminology, such as late capitalism, production of subjectivity, how globalization or late capitalism has structured our relationship to society. And of course, he's applying the Lacanian framework to kind of outline that structure in some form of coherence. And, while I'm reading this, it's dense, but in another way, it's also fascinating, as he's attempting to kind of identify, I think, the burnout, the stress, the fragmentation that we might be experiencing today in our world. But as a reflection point, and the reason why I'm probably doing these videos is I'm somebody who has a tendency to isolate, or my patterns and repetitions and habits tend towards isolation or internalization rather than social spheres. So I'm just passing by a billiards, and I'm just seeing all these people as they attempt to enjoy their time. They often enjoy together. I see that in Vietnam a lot of younger people often enjoying together, and yet it doesn't make sense to me because it's always like I'm structuring people around my enjoyment, and often my enjoyment is in isolation. So I'm always trying to find a way to read a book alone, or try to find a way to be alone. And then when it comes to others, it's always like a stress. It's always like a caution, an alert. And so I'm curious. So I just have been thinking about Lacan here, and to kind of frame Lacan and how he thinks about life is structured, or psychic life is structured, is he establishes three orders: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. Okay. And these three realms, or orders, help us understand a sense of ourself, a sense of our desire, and a sense of our relationships. So to speak of the imaginary, Lacan, borrowing of course, and I think metastasizing or growing from psychoanalytic Sigmund Freud theory, is the imaginary is understood as the realm of images, ideal egos, and identification. So the imaginary is a space that occurs particularly beginning at the mirror stage. So the mirror stage is the moment in which we recognize a self. So we see ourselves for probably the first time, or recognize that there is something distinct about myself from myself. So mirror stage, you could kind of see it as, you kind of see yourself as a whole. That in the mirror, generally speaking, there is that is me, and I know what I am because I can see me, I am what I am. But of course, it's a disruption in the same sense that we can't actually grasp ourselves because we're not actually organizers of reality. We don't produce this experience. We are actors within reality rather than reality itself, in a way. So this identification with yourself as a whole unified being is a sort of misidentification. Um, and this is kind of how we hold ourselves, and we might hold ourselves in a certain way through our identity, as we see ourselves as successful or see ourselves as good or benevolent or beautiful or kind or loving. But of course, throughout our lives, we're often, shown or confronted the reality that these ideas that we attempt to hold together about who make us up or how we make ourselves up are distorted. They you can never really live up to the fantasy of who you want to be completely. There's always going to be distortions, and there's always going to be misinterpretations along the way when people see you and how they identify you, and you're also catching up to how other people identify you as well. So from this imaginary stage, ChatGPT, great tool, kind of told me, about my experience, and kind of reflected back to me on my relationship to the gay community, and the gay community for me, and I mean this is, and the Vietnamese community, but let's go back to the gay community, has always been something very uncomfortable because immediately when we think about organizing identity around sexuality and a kind of very private sphere of experience, you're going to end up in a lot of uncomfortable distortions of reality. In a way, you could call it distortion. I kind of see it that way, but where certain values end up organizing in ways that might cause discomfort on how you're identified by others. In the gay environment, it's been very much about appearances and sort of values distributed alongside image and power and status. So immediately when I went to more what seemed to be more caring spaces. I was part of an NGO, attempting to create social projects for underprivileged individuals. There was definitely still, a distribution of value and a sort of intense overarching atmosphere of sexuality that kind of pervaded the space. And if you ever go to a gay bar, I mean, any bar in general, but of course, for me as somebody who's gay, I'm gonna probably go to a gay bar. Sexuality at times it's kind of overabundant in the sense where you'll hear stories or you'll see how hypersexualized a gay space might be, where you might be immediately hypersexualized and maybe flirting is it goes way beyond flirting, where it's just in intense sexual encounters. So yeah, it's a bit intense at times. So I've always been off put. So how often within gay environments or gay spaces, there's this tendency to over sexualization, hypersexualization that makes it uncomfortable. So in another way, yeah, Vietnamese spaces. So in this way, Vietnamese spaces have always, and also been another one where as I've attempted to learn the language, I felt very coined into a role in a different sense where I felt hyper identified as this foreign other and kind of organized on another set of registers that kind of alienated me from myself. So certain fantasies or ideas about whiteness, certain fantasies, ideas about foreignness, about appearance that often made me feel very uncomfortable. In particular, as somebody who identifies as gay or LGBT, there'd be a lot of questions about who I am in a way that didn't allow me space to identify who I was, where it was like, so you have a wife, are you married, you have a girlfriend, right? And I'm just was always kind of made me feel uncomfortable, or oh, I'm gonna judge, this is how you look in my eyes in a sort of sexualized way, or in regard to beauty. And it was very uncomfortable, objectifying, and frustrating for me, and alienating. So, yeah, ChatGPT kind of says that for my imaginary, that there is a particular gap or wound between my real vulnerable self. So in some sense, a sort of matrix or identification of understanding of who I am, and I would say an identification produced by others. So I kind of get caught in this loop of trying to close this gap. And what happens for me is I've had the habit of taking endless selfies to kind of try to perform myself correctly for the world, in this incredible anxiety of personhood that I could maybe fit the other's idea of me in order to feel a sense of inclusion. And that inclusion might be in gay communities, or inclusion might be with friends, or other Vietnamese, in the sense of learning Vietnamese. The next field would be the symbolic. So the symbolic is understood as the realm of language, law, and social structure. This is the order of the big other. So the big other in Lacanian Framework is understood as sort of the unconscious society, norms, laws, language that shape how you relate to others and yourself. So these are the types of, this is generally what society, in a way, tells you about how to perform yourself correctly, and how to integrate into the social body in a way that allows you an opportunity to flourish. But you can already see from the imaginary, there's already an impossible traversal there, where you're always going to end up in a conflict with your understanding of yourself, which is also a calculation without certainty, and then the big other, which attempts to kind of help you in one way to organize yourself, but in another way, setting a sort of dictation of who you should be, or how you can best fit within in the social order. So at this perspective, this symbolic is where you become a subject by entering language. But of course, once again, just like the mirror stage, where you identify with yourself, and yet you're always kind of catching up to who you are, language also invites the same kind of paradox, where, oh, now I have a tool to name myself. I have this capacity to recite myself in relation to the world. But in reality, of course, we can't completely identify ourselves or explain ourselves, or how we are in this world. And Lacanian Framework would say that you must repress or hold back parts of yourself to be legible, right? So we're not always in the sense of the gay context. I would say being gay isn't something like an as I would say an out and a what would you say, a closeted binary. it's always a process. It's always something where I have to check in and see how safe I feel to share about my identity. So I'm not always, I'm always questioning. I have to be careful. So particularly when spaces of power, when somebody has power over me, I'm not going to be comfortable sharing, say, my sexuality, or if I'm married or I'm going to marry a person, a woman or a man in any sense, given that power relation and what's at risk in that moment. So it's always a process rather than a binary stepping stone from closeted to outness. And that can kind of make sense of how language, in a sense, um, is always, in a way, not able to completely produce you or others in a way. It's always kind of missing some. There's always a missing piece to how we understand ourselves. Um, so in what ChatGPT has kind of aggregated here, it says that I've often felt disposable in social systems, trapped by national institutional structures, and always proving my worth. So, yeah, I think this has something to do with my own childhood, um, childhood where I was somebody who isolated. So, I've had a tendency not to desire connection for whatever reason. I've found more interest in stories and found more interest in fantasy rather than actual meaningful social connection. So, in another way, I felt like in order, because I'm required to be a part and earn my keep in this world, I've had to kind of, I've always held a sense of, oh, I have to be ashamed for who I am as a person, and I must prove myself. I must prove myself to others in order to be included, and also not only lose myself through the symbolic as a natural process of the symbolic, but also disavow myself often, betray myself at times in order to feel a sense of inclusion, which is not a way to live in another way. So anyway, I often see, the law or the other as harsh, excluding, unjust, and I often don't feel seen or heard in this world. Um, so yeah, next moving forward, finally we have the real. So the real is number 3 in this sort of social symbolic order that Lacan structures here. And the realist is what's unsymbolizable, the traumatic kernel of experience. So it's what escapes both image and language. It's the void around which our desire circulates. So in reality, the real is something that, it's uncomfortable. That's the real. That's fear, essentially. In many ways, it's the uncomfortable truth that is revealed to us through illness, through death, through failure, projections of failure. It's revealed to us through tragedy, through paradox. So obviously when things don't align with our expectations of how reality is understood to be, say the law is not acting in our understanding, or a person or an institution is acting outside of our sense of understanding that provides stability, comfort, and trust. So the real is what escapes and what seeps out of reality that causes discomfort, and then we're always trying to cover up, and we need to in many ways. We to live or to attempt to strive in a pure real is to attempt to live in pure chaos, and then as a species in this world, we can't survive that way if we don't have the fantasies of order to guide us towards living our lives and having an opportunity to flourish. So it's necessary that in some way we cover up the real, but also very much acknowledge the real as a structural component of reality. in order to persist. So the real is also understood as jouissance. It's a painful excess of enjoyment that doesn't make sense. So jouissance is another one of his terminology, and it's sort of that I would say intensity, or even in some sense the fantasy that we hold to any object that we desire. And that might be in a concrete sense the fantasy of what would happen if I obtain that object. Say if the holiday is coming, and it's that sort of warm fuzzy feeling of anticipation of the goodness that comes from that, or that your children might get married, and it's that fuzzy feeling that, like, I was a good parent. Or the graduation, you finished and you're about to graduate, and that's that feeling. But of course, jouissance is something. It's an abstraction where, once the event happens, the event itself that we're anticipating doesn't always end up feeling the same way as jouissance, or the anticipation of the event itself. And often we're kind of disappointed, but we might not. We can be somewhat surprised if we don't hold too steadfast to expectation for any situation or event. So those were the three realms there. Just going back, for the real for me, and what ChatGPT identifies, is that it's my experience of feeling shattered by social rejection, by being consumed by longing or envy, by cheating, and something that has come up often in my in some later years, parts of my life. I was somebody devoted often, but I have been somebody who's cheated, but often as a response to shame and anxiety. And finally, seeking a kind of peace in the belief that life is predetermined. Yeah, so I've, in some way, in another way, it's like these fantasies that we sometimes like destiny, or predeterminism. They kind of this is like a blanketing of the real. We attempt to kind of cover over this uncomfortable feeling that we are in complete control of this reality, particularly when we're faced with contradictions of our own self-production, or contradictions in the world of let's say something happening in Gaza. So the symbolic and imaginary in these situations is unable to hold together, and what often happens is the potential for depression, panic, manic state, psychosis, any sort of neurotic state, maybe perpetual or chronic, or not, is sort of like an ongoing, I suppose, reaction to the real. So anyway, this is Lacan's framework has the opportunity to attempt to support healing, but he doesn't. This framework doesn't really support or anything in regard to self-help. So what Lacan's framework generally does is number one, it kind of encourages us to traverse the fantasy. So and try to understand how a lot of our identifications and the language that we carry about ourselves in the world are kind of crutches, and they're not really material or solid in any sense, and how in some ways they can hold us back. So if we can let go of that fantasy, we can live better in this sort of in the truth of this reality. When we have language to symbolize trauma, okay, then we have an opportunity to kind of make sense of the chaos of this experience. So I felt in some ways, therapy and psychoanalysis and other frameworks have allowed me ways to kind of organize the chaotic nature of reality and allow me a sense of peace. And finally, one of the primary components of this is to reconfigure desire. So if we understand reality is structured by lack, and that our desire is inherently coded into that lack, whereby we're constantly circulating around an object that's never solid. So that's also why the object is never as satisfying, or never really aligns with our expectations of what we expect it to be once we have it. Um, and and that kind of shields us in a way from depression, but it also has a tendency to cynicism if you're not careful, which I've been I've done as well. So, anyways, this is just trying to organize an understanding of Lacan's theories and frameworks, and invite a conversation about how reality can be shaped to help us better understand our experiences. Okay, thank you.